Okay, welcome to this lecture. This is the lecture for Wednesday, equivalent to the Wednesday, the 3rd of December class. Now, there's going to be two more formal lectures, two more formal recorded lectures, but as of now, I don't plan to examine the content of those two lectures in either the January exam for for want of a better word, the minute-based students. And I won't be obviously putting down the exam paper for the Erasmus exam for the 4 international students. So in terms of what's going to appear in either the December exam for the Erasmus international students or the January exam for the rest of the students, the minute-based students, what you're going to see on the exam is what's going to appear in the exam is everything I've covered from the start of November, immediately after the Halloween break, up until this very lecture. Now, if things don't work out for you, and you end up having to redo the exam in August, then the next two lectures, there will be a question based on the next two lectures in the August exam. But as of now, for those of you looking ahead to the December Erasmus International exam or the January exam for the minute-based students, as of now, this is the last lecture that's going to contain material that will appear on the exam papers. So yeah, so just a reminder, Section A, the main assignments based on Section A, so that's already assessed, that section fully assessed. Section B, environmental politics or environmental policy making, and Section C, nation states and nationalism. They are the two, that's what you're going to be examined on. So all the material that you're going to be examined on has been covered by recorded lectures. So if you missed a few recorded lectures, you can go back and listen to them. It's a big difference to listen a lecture in class, because all you get in that case are the lecture slides. So you do have a bit of an advantage, in fairness, going into the upcoming exams. Now, today I'm going to talk about nation building and nation branding. And I'm going to talk about how countries, especially new countries, can use these processes to increase the level of legitimacy, of state legitimacy in terms of the state's own population, but also increase recognition of that state on the global stage by participating in major sporting events like the Olympics and the World Cup, or major international cultural events like the Eurovision Song Contest. I'm going to suggest today that for new European countries, and a lot of new European countries emerged on the scene in the 1990s and 2000s, for new European countries, the Eurovision Song Contest is probably the most effective way of engaging in the processes of what we're going to call nation building and especially nation branding, because there are certain advantages to taking part in Eurovision that you don't get if you're taking part in the World Cup or the Olympics, especially if you're a very small new European country. So the point I finished off on in the last lecture was where we were talking about what determines whether a territory effectively does become accepted as a full member state of the United Nations. I made the point a lot of it had to do with the attitudes of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, but more specifically the attitudes of the United States of America, China and Russia. States can become fully recognized members of the United Nations ultimately if these superpowers agree to support their independence claims, or if these superpowers are largely don't care. So long as it's not against their own specific interests. So we saw already that in the last lecture, in yesterday's recorded lecture, we saw that the United States refused to recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states. We saw Russia refuse to accept Kosovo as an independent state. Whereas for other territories, Montenegro, South Sudan, East Timor, there was no real opposition within the Security Council towards recognizing these as independent states, and they were, in that case, they said, okay, we'll accept these as member states. So the most recent new member states of the United Nations, East Timor, South Sudan, Montenegro, probably should also add Serbia there, because Serbia emerged as a state on its own as part of that breakup with Montenegro in 2006. Now, you might think that's the end of the process. You're now a fully accepted member of the United Nations. You've now you now have scope to build up diplomatic relations with other countries. The problem is that's not the end of the story. A new state still faces a battle to survive, because international independence can be hard to attain. Full-blown independence can be hard to attain, but things can change very quickly. We had a number of new independent states in Eastern Europe in the 1920s. World War II happened, and then suddenly those what were new states like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, suddenly found themselves back as part of the Soviet Union. So independence has to be maintained. And you need to advertise the fact that you're an independent member state, because you want other countries to support you, especially at times of need. So Ukraine has had support from a number of other countries during the war with Russia, because other countries recognize Ukraine as an independent state. Ukraine has built up, in the decades leading to the war, people had got to know about Ukraine. And one of the ways that people got to know a lot about Ukraine, funnily enough, particularly Europeans, was in the Eurovision Song Contest, because Ukraine, during the 2000s, has probably had one of the best records, if not the best records, of any European country in Eurovision during that period. So taking part in events like that lets ordinary Europeans know that you exist as an independent state. So when the war between Ukraine and Russia, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, a lot of Europeans had heard of Ukraine. And I'll be honest, a lot of Europeans had probably heard about Ukraine through either the Eurovision Song Contest, or because the European Soccer Championships in 2012 took part partly in Ukraine, or because they heard of Ukrainian soccer players like Andrei Shevchenko. So cultural events, sporting events, play a very important role for new states to establish, to advertise their independence on the global stage, to let other people in other countries around the world know that they are independent states, that they exist. And this allows then for the building up of trade relations, of diplomatic relations, and it also allows, of course, for the building up of tourist markets as well. So new states and nation building. So once you've got independence, you've got to build up a sense of legitimacy in the state. You need the citizens of your new independent state to believe in the state, to support the state, to see the state as their political representation. So to develop this sense of legitimacy in the state and the government of the state, new states always undergo a process of what's called nation building. And this has definitely been something that's been very evident in the last 100 or 200 years, since the rise of nationalism and over the last 200 years, and liberal democracy effectively the last 100 years or so. The process of nation building tends to be more and the person to read about this is Paul Jordan, and Paul Jordan's books on the reading list for this section. You'll see the reading list back in the reading list for this section is also included in the general reading list I offered at the start of the lectures last week. So Paul Jordan's book, definitely is worth reading for this. So he says it's a political process. It involves a state-controlled means of socialization to get people socialized into getting used to being members of the new state, but it also involves certain ideologies being put forward, certain ideas being put forward about what's the right way to behave in this new state. What in the state of Estonia, what's seen as being purely, truly Estonian, what's not seen as being Estonian. So in Ireland, we went through this process of nation building in the 1920s and 1930s. So a growing level of adherence or loyalty to Irish cultural values, and an attempt to break away from the past, an attempt to break away from Ireland's previous identity as being part of the British, of the United Kingdom or the British Empire. So a rejection of the immediate past. So there's two different things taking part in the nation building process. Paul Jordan mainly writes about Estonia, the Baltic states, and he says, the nation building process in states like Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia in the 1990s and 2000s mainly involved a rejection of the immediate past, the rejection of their history as being part of the Soviet Union, more or less from the end of World War II up until 1991. It placed emphasis on the national language, Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian. And this increased emphasis on the national language did create a certain level of division, because all these states, especially Latvia and Estonia, did include a large number of Russian speakers, a large number of ethnic Russians. So nation building processes can be exclusionary. They will tend to highlight the political and cultural interests of the major group in the new state. So Estonian cultural practices, the Estonian language, Latvian cultural practices, and the Latvian language. And as such, other languages can be excluded. So as it says, a process, Jordan suggests, risks othering the Russian-speaking minorities in these countries, making the Russian-speaking minorities not really feel part of the new state, as if their language was a secondary language in the new state. Now, nation building is closely linked to nation branding, as well as building up state legitimacy, as well as building up a common language, common cultural practices within the new state. It happened in the Republic of Ireland in the 1920s, 1930s, happened in parts of Eastern Europe in the 1990s and 2000s. Nation branding is also important. You want to build up a sense, internally, you want to build up a sense of state legitimacy amongst the people of the new state, but on the global stage, you want to increase recognition of your own state. You want people around the world to know about your own state. So this will then allow for the building up of interlinkages between your state and other states around the world. As Paul Jordan says, to do this, the country first has to be known on the map and have the reputation of a reliable partner. In this context, nation branding campaigns and popular cultural media events, such as the Eurovision Song Contest, have significance attached to them, especially by the newly sovereign nations, that should be states, Paul, as they seek to negotiate their position on the world stage. So an event like the Eurovision Song Contest allows you to advertise the fact that, yes, look, if you're this is of course for European countries, yes, look, we are a new state, we are a new European state. We are participating in the Eurovision Song Contest, and we're doing so on an equal playing field with other European states like France and Germany. And in doing so, in taking part in the Eurovision Song Contest, in getting our 4 minutes of fame, or 8 minutes of fame if you do very well in the Eurovision Song Contest, we are making a claim that we are as European as Germany is, as France is, as Italy is, and we are making a claim to be recognised as full-blown independent states. And for a lot of these new countries like Moldova, like Azerbaijan, the first time a lot of people around Europe, including people in Ireland, the first time people ever heard about these states was when these countries actually took part in Eurovision. And when these countries took part in Eurovision, in the 1990s and 2000s, they really took part in Eurovision. They threw everything at Eurovision because they knew that It's one thing to be recognised as being part of Eurovision, to be recognised as a state because you're taking part in Eurovision. It's another thing to be recognised by doing well in Eurovision, by building up a certain image of your country in taking part in Eurovision. Sometimes it's a stereotype, but you want to get across, you just don't want to take part in Eurovision, you want to build up an image of your country, ideally a positive image. So Moldova, generally catchy songs, that kind of tap along songs, and people will look at the Moldovan entry and go, oh, Moldova, that's their song. Oh, you know what? I actually like that. That's catchy. Oh, they look like they're great crack. I don't know where to go on holidays next year. Maybe Moldova might be an option. I hear it's not going to be too expensive. Now, nation branding is viewed as a form of soft power. So there's different forms of power. Hard power involves military power, involves governments flexing their muscles. Soft power involves states building up reputations, building up relationships with each other. And so this form of soft power, nation branding, can be used to build up trade links, diplomatic ties, but it can also be used to develop your own state's tourism market. So as Jordan says, nation branding represents the desires by the countries concerned to make people want to pay attention to their particular nation state, their achievements, as well as building belief in its qualities. So in order for any trade relationship, any diplomatic relationship to exist, people in other states need to know about your state, and you want to build up an image of your state, an image that your state is as European as other states, if you're talking about states like Estonia and Lithuania, but also an image of your state that it's a state that you can rely on. It'll be a reliable partner in terms of international relations. It'll be a reliable partner in terms of diplomacy. It'll also be a very nice place to visit if you want to go and visit. And it'll probably be cheaper than going to somewhere else like parts of Western Europe. So the general argument is that nation branding, that states need to engage in nation building in order to build up the legitimacy of the state, a sense of legitimacy in the state amongst the citizens of that state, but they need to engage in nation branding on the global stage in order to respond to the demands of effective economic globalization. Nation branding, just like nation building, nation branding can be exclusionary because part of the nation branding process is to try and create certain images or representations of your state. And generally the images that you'll want to create are images that you associate with the dominant ethnic group or the dominant nation within those states. So the images Estonia will be portraying will be images that will be more associated with the ethnic Estonians living in the state, and less so images that you would associate with the ethnic Russians, the minority Russian groups living in that state. So some images, stereotypes, portrayals of the state will be used. Other elements of the state will generally be overlooked or excluded. Now, Paul Jordan suggests that the Eurovision Song Contest can play an important role in the nation branding process, and it really did seem to play a very important role in nation branding processes, especially for states in Eastern Europe in the 1990s and the 2000s. Paul Jordan says you could look on the Eurovision Song Contest as being the modern equivalent of the old world fairs you had roughly around the late 1800s, early 1900s, where different states would go to the world fairs and advertise certain elements or products associated with that state. So he says it's like the world fairs of the 1800s. It's a showcase for elements of national culture and identity. It allows countries to market themselves to a wider audience on their own terms, and that's the key point. The way you portray yourself at Eurovision is defined solely by yourself. You can't do that in the Olympics. You probably want to go to the Olympics and portray your country as a successful sporting country. You can't, because you're up against other countries. If you're a very small European country, you're probably coming into it at a disadvantage. You don't have enough people to be able to compete. You don't have the sporting facilities to be able to compete with other countries like USA or Russia. So if you go to the Olympics hoping to market your country, you might find you've very little potential for doing so. If if you're not winning any medals at all, no one's going to notice you. If you're like a country like Kazakhstan, who do win medals, but win medals in the niche sports, the less popular sports, very few people are going to hear about this as well. They might notice on the medal table, oh, look, Kazakhstan's 36. What did they win all their medals in? No, Greco-Roman wrestling, right? That's nice, okay. So you want people to pay attention to your country, and you want to define the way you present your country on your own terms. You can't do that in the Olympics. You can't, like, Olympics, World Cup, it's expectations versus reality. Expectations. We'll go to the Olympics, we'll win loads of medals, everyone will go, wow, this is a great country. Reality, you go to the Olympics, you win no medals. No one hears about you. World Cup, we're going to take part in the World Cup, we'll qualify, we'll get there, we'll beat Brazil, everyone will be talking about us. Reality, in the World Cup qualifying group, you finish bottom of the group, no one hears about you apart from the countries that play you in that group, and the perception they're getting of you is, wow, they're really bad at soccer. Eurovision Song Contest, you can do whatever you like. You have 3 minutes on the stage to portray, obviously it's a song, but you can use that song to portray certain images of your country. You can get across certain stereotypes, representations of your country. If you want your country to appear friendly, you use the Eurovision stage to do so. If you want to get another idea or stereotype about your country on the Eurovision stage, you can use the Eurovision stage to do so. So there are similarities, as I say, with other big cultural sporting events like the Olympics and the World Cup. But with Eurovision, you have the ability to define your own image. And if you're willing to invest a lot, if you really try hard at Eurovision, you have a good chance of achieving success. This was definitely the case in the 1990s and the 2000s, because in the 1990s and 2000s, a lot of the Western European countries were more or less going through the motions with Eurovision. Whereas the Eastern European countries emerged on the scene. They wanted to take part in Eurovision. They were desperate to take part in Eurovision. I might talk about Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1993 later on, but they were so desperate to take part in Eurovision. In the case of some countries, they literally had just become independent, and the first thing they were doing was taking part in Eurovision. Because Eurovision allows them to say, look, to the rest, to not just states in Europe, but other people in Europe. Taking part in Eurovision allowed them to say, look, we are taking part in Eurovision, we are equal, we are now a fully blown state, we are now a fully blown European state, we have the same rights to take part in this contest as Spain has, as the United Kingdom has, as the Republic of Ireland has. Now, Eurovision in the 1990s, as I said, Western European countries really had stopped trying with Eurovision in the 1990s and 2000s. They started to get their act together again in the 2010s, when they suddenly got a bit tired of always losing. But the real efforts that were being made in Eurovision in the 1990s and especially the 2000s were being made by Eastern European countries, and particularly by a lot of the new Eastern European countries that had emerged in the 1990s and 2000s. So if you look at some of these countries, Estonia won Eurovision, Latvia won Eurovision, Azerbaijan won Eurovision, Ukraine won, at last count I think, they've won Eurovision at least, is it 3 times or 4 times? Ukraine's won a lot of Eurovisions. So a lot of the new member states took part, but they didn't just take part, they did very well in Eurovision. They made a huge effort in Eurovision. Whereas a country like United Kingdom might be sending someone who finished in 7th place in X Factor. Countries like Ukraine, like Estonia, like even Russia, they were sending their big acts to the Eurovision stage. So there was a rush of new countries to enter Eurovision in the 1990s and 2000s. As soon as the Iron Curtain collapsed, broke down, as soon as the communist regimes in Eastern Europe collapsed, countries like Poland, Hungary wanted to take part in Eurovision. The new member states all wanted to take part in Eurovision. Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina literally took part in Eurovision literally months after, or just over a year after they were accepted as fully blown independent states. So, as Jordan says, for a country like Estonia, Eurovision provided a platform not only for showing that they were a normal independent country and an integral part of Europe, but Eurovision also allowed them to compete on a level playing field with the major Western powers. They weren't coming into Eurovision at a disadvantage. They weren't coming into Eurovision knowing, okay, like the Estonian soccer team, we're going into this tournament and we're up against Germany, we're up against Italy, we've no chance of beating them. The best thing we can do is keep the score down. Or going to the Olympics. Okay, we're Estonia, we might do okay at some niche sports, but very few people are going to be talking about Estonia at the Olympics. The most extreme example of just how seriously the new independent states took Eurovision was Bosnia-Herzegovina with the 1993 Eurovision, which took place in Mill Street in County Cork. Bosnia and Herzegovina was literally, as an independent state, was literally only a few months, had only been accepted as an independent state a few months before the Mill Street contest. At this point in time, and roughly between 1992 and 1995, Bosnia-Herzegovina was undergoing a very brutal civil war. It was a state, it was accepted as an independent state by a lot of countries around the world, but the government of Bosnia-Herzegovina didn't control all the state territory. In fact, the government of Bosnia-Herzegovina at that point in time didn't control all the territory of the capital city, Sarajevo. So even getting to Eurovision was a very dangerous prospect for Bosnia-Herzegovina, literally because the airport in Sarajevo was under attack from ethnic Serb rebels, and you're risking your life trying to get out through the airport in Sarajevo. And the band that represented Bosnia-Herzegovina at this contest managed to make it to Mill Street, but some members of the delegation just couldn't get out through the airport, so they had to stay at home. So even getting to Eurovision was a risky prospect for Bosnia-Herzegovina that year. But it was a risk they were willing to take, because Bosnia-Herzegovina wanted to get people to hear about their country. They wanted to take part in Eurovision. They wanted to be at Eurovision on the same stage as France, the United Kingdom, the Republic of Ireland and Spain and other European countries. They wanted people to recognise Bosnia-Herzegovina as a new independent state, especially at a point in time where the ability of that state to survive was very much in question. And they also wanted to draw people's attention to the ongoing civil war in Bosnia-Herzegovina and the knock-on effects of that for the Bosnian citizens. So Eurovision was seen by Bosnia-Herzegovina as a particularly powerful means for them to get across a political message to the rest of Europe and indeed the rest of the world. So a few facts and figures about Eurovision. So if you're talking about nation building, nation branding, definitely the first 7 slides are important here. The who, the whys, the whos, the wheres of Eurovision. I'll give you a quick rundown. So the first contest was first held in 1956 in Switzerland. The 7 countries that took part in Eurovision that year were Switzerland. And this is interesting because for the first few decades of Eurovision's existence, it's very much a Western European contest. The 6 founding members of the European Union was, first of all, the European Coal and Steel Community. Later on, it becomes the European Economic Community. So those were France, Germany, and Italy, and the 3 Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Entry in the contest is open to all member states of what's called the European Broadcasting Union. And you can become a member state of the European Broadcasting Union if you are located within what's called the European Broadcasting Zone. Now, this is interesting because European Broadcasting Zone, of course, includes all the European countries, but it's defined by a certain degree of latitude and a certain degree of longitude. And it also pulls in all the countries in North Africa and a number of countries in the Middle East. So if people ask why does Israel take part in Eurovision, even though it's not technically part of Europe, the answer is it's located within the European Broadcasting Zone. Morocco actually took part in Eurovision in 1980. Lebanon were, and at different stages looked as if Lebanon and Tunisia might take part in Eurovision, but they later withdrew. So membership of Eurovision is open to all member states of the European Broadcasting Union. And you can be a member of the European Broadcasting Union if you're a state in North Africa or a state in the Middle East, because all these states fall within the European Broadcasting Zone. So there's a number of former contestants there. I've included Luxembourg there. Luxembourg's actually back in Eurovision the last 2 years. I need to update that slide. Monaco took part in Eurovision a lot in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and then withdrew, and then took part in Eurovision for a few years in the 2000s and withdrew again. Morocco took part in Eurovision for 1 year only. Andorra took part in Eurovision for a few years in the early 2000s. Slovakia took part in Eurovision in the 1990s and the 2000s. Turkey took part in Eurovision more or less from the 1970s up until the early 2010s, and then withdrew. And there's a lot of interesting things we can talk about in terms of, Turkey's decision to withdraw from Eurovision, which is quite similar to Hungary's decision. But obviously, this is a discussion for a different type of lecture. Bulgaria withdrew from Eurovision a few years ago, but I think Bulgaria is coming back. North Macedonia withdrew. I think North Macedonia is coming back next year. Romania also withdrew from Eurovision, but I think Romania is coming back. Montenegro withdrew, and then Montenegro came back last year. Belarus and Russia have been excluded because their state broadcasters. Ultimately, why have they been excluded? Their state broadcasters have been expelled from the European Broadcasting Union. So it's about their state broadcasters. Jordan, Lebanon, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, and the Vatican City are active European Broadcasting Union members, and if they wanted to, they could take part in Eurovision. Lebanon and Tunisia were planning to take part in Eurovision. In the case of Lebanon, they'd already selected a song, and then they withdrew. And the main cause of their withdrawal was because they didn't want to appear in the same contest as Israel. The most successful country in Eurovision history up until a few years ago, when the bloody Swedes equalled our record, was Ireland with 7 wins. Sweden has also got 7 wins, cursed their souls. The Dutch, Luxembourg, the United Kingdom and France have won Eurovision on 5 occasions. Language, most of the winning songs in Eurovision, particularly since the 1990s, have been performed in English. There were a lot of French language winners in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, but the last song sung in French to win Eurovision was Celine Dion's song in 1988. Yes, Celine Dion won Eurovision for Switzerland. For much of the contest history, up until the late 1990s, there was a native language rule, which meant you had to sing in one of your country's official national languages. That was an advantage in the 50s, 60s and 70s for France and Luxembourg, and to a lesser extent, Monaco and Belgium and Switzerland, because French was the most popular language in Eurovision in those decades. Since the 1980s, it's been an advantage to sing in English. And as I said already, since the 1990s, most of the successful songs in Eurovision have been sung in English. Okay, I'm going to take a break there because there's a cat bawling at me. Now, in the constitution of the Eurovision Song Contest, the Eurovision Song Contest claims it's a non-political contest, but there's always political dimensions running through the contest, at different stages. In some cases, you get political conflicts taking place when countries are selecting their songs. There can be political conflicts taking place as part of Eurovision as well. Sometimes the way you stage the contests, there can be a political dimension there. There's a very strong element of politics running through the Eurovision voting patterns, and I'll talk about those later on. As Jordan says, the Eurovision Song Contest has often reflected or even shaped attitudes towards Europeanness. An examination of its history provides an opportunity to explore how the contest has echoed and driven change, showcasing how countries want to be perceived by others through participating or hosting the contest. So that's a key point. How countries want to be perceived by other countries through participating in the contest, or if you win Eurovision, how do you want to be perceived when you get to host the contest? So there's a politics of participation and participants. Some countries participate in Eurovision, other countries choose not to do so, and there can be political reasons for that. Some have suggested that can be a protest element with Eurovision voting. In 2003, the United Kingdom finished last in the 2003 Eurovision Song Contest, and this was a few months after the United Kingdom was involved in the invasion of Iraq along with USA. So some people felt, oh, it's a protest vote against the war in Iraq. Unfortunately, the problem really was it wasn't a great year for the United Kingdom at Eurovision. The song was, they had vocal problems in the middle of the song, and it probably wasn't going to get points no matter what is happening politically that year. Some people have suggested that there was a protest vote against Ireland in the 2008 Song Contest because of that god-awful song from Dustin the Turkey, which embarrassed the country terribly. I think a lot of European countries just decided it was a rubbish song and just didn't vote for it more than protest. Well, it did annoy a lot. The Dustin the Turkey song did annoy a lot of other European countries in that year. And it was kind of an interesting one because it basically was it was performed literally right at the tail end of the Celtic Tiger. And there was a sense that the Irish were kind of saying to the rest of Europe, we won Eurovision loads of times. We don't care about winning anymore. We're smarter than you. Look at us. We want to show how little we care by sending this puppet to Eurovision, and we're going to slag off the rest of you. And the Eastern European countries went, right. And some people have suggested Ireland's reputation at Eurovision took a long time for Ireland to rebuild its reputation at Eurovision after the Dustin the Turkey incident. Ireland hasn't really done well at Eurovision in the years after that. In fairness, Jedward did try to rebuild some diplomatic relations, but there's only so much Jedward can do. So Eurovision can be a reflection of internal politics. Eurovision can be a battleground, or it can be a peacemaker. So Turkey-Cyprus, since the invasion of North Cyprus by Turkey in the 1970s, there's always been tension at Eurovision between Turkey, Cyprus and Greece. Greece and Cyprus would always give each other the 12 points. Greece and Cyprus would always give 0 points to Turkey and vice versa. But in the early 2000s, there was a bit of a thaw politically between Turkey and Cyprus. There were efforts made to engage in more peace negotiations. And as part of that, Cyprus decided to award Turkey 8 points at the 2003 Eurovision Song Contest. And actually, these 8 points helped Turkey to win that year's Song Contest. So you can see peace efforts sometimes reflected. You can see tensions between different countries also evident at Eurovision. So tensions between Georgia and Russia. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. The following year, Russia was hosting Eurovision. Most people thought Georgia wasn't going to take part, but Georgia said they were going to take part, and then they entered a song called "We Don't Wanna Putin." They called it Putin, but it was obviously a slag of an effort to slag off Vladimir Putin. Eurovision said, that's a bit political, Georgia. Georgia said, no, it's not. It's put in. We're not referring to anyone. Eurovision said, Georgia, we're going to have to ask you to change the lyrics. Georgia said, we're not going to do that. Eurovision said, well, Georgia, if you don't change the lyrics, you can't take part. And Georgia said, fair enough, so we weren't going to take part anyway. The conflicts between Armenians and people in Azerbaijan, linked in part to Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia and Azerbaijan have often used Eurovision to kind of get across the different attitudes in terms of the conflicts between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which effectively has been a conflict ongoing since the breakup of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. In fact, it was a conflict that started before the breakup of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. And Armenia and Azerbaijan have often used the Eurovision stage to kind of put across their own political views, but also get digs at the other country as well, and lay claim to the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh at times. So voting patterns. Voting patterns reflect musical trends, so certain types of music are more popular at different stages. Voting patterns can reflect the changing Eurovision Song Contest rules. Voting patterns can reflect the changing membership of the European Union. So in the 70s, 80s and 1990s, most of the countries in Eurovision were Western European states. And that meant that countries like Greece and Turkey were often at a disadvantage because they were taking part in Eurovision in a contest where, and Yugoslavia as well in the 70s and 80s, they were taking part in a contest where most of the entrants were Western European countries. All of a sudden, in the 2000s, when you got this big upsurge of new countries entering Eurovision, particularly from Eastern Europe, all of a sudden, Greece, Turkey, Serbia suddenly found that they were doing a lot better at Eurovision than they had been doing in the 1970s and 1980s. Changes in voting procedure. Eurovision, the voting at Eurovision up to the late 1990s was solely based on voting juries. In the late 1990s, public voting was brought in. From the late 1990s up until the late 2000s, 2009, the contest was solely based on public voting. A lot of people suggested that this led to political voting. I'd actually argue it was less political voting, more cultural voting or diaspora voting. So televoting was introduced to Eurovision in 1997 and 1998. Some people suggested it was a response to the fact that Ireland was winning the whole time in the 1990s. And people were getting sick of Ireland winning the whole time. Ireland was winning with very good songs, but very good songs that weren't very popular with the public, that weren't really achieving a lot of chart success. So the decision was made to bring in televoting. It was a knock-on effect for Ireland. The first year you had full televoting, Ireland finished in 8th position. So Ireland did not as well as they had done in previous years, but Ireland still did fairly well that year. The next change was 1999, the abolition of the native language rule. And I would argue for Ireland's prospects in Eurovision, this had the biggest impact. Because up until 1999, there were only 3 countries who could perform in English at Eurovision: the United Kingdom, Malta and Ireland. And Ireland, there's no doubt Ireland was getting an advantage from being able to perform in English, especially in the 1980s and 1990s. Change in the contest format. Up until 2003, you had only 20-something countries taking part in Eurovision each year, and most of those 20-something countries were countries from Western Europe. In 2004, they brought in what was called the semi-final system. And this now meant that you could now have 40-something countries taking part in Eurovision, and all of a sudden, you now had 20-something or 30-something Eastern European countries all taking part in Eurovision, all being able to vote in Eurovision. And this totally changed the game in terms of voting patterns. There was a lot of upset in Western Europe in terms of what happened in the 2000s, because in the 2000s, the Eastern European countries dominated Eurovision. Most people blame it on the voting, on televoting, on public voting. The truth is, like in the 2000s, countries like Ukraine and Turkey and Serbia and Russia were just putting a lot more effort into Eurovision. The Western countries, the Western European countries like Germany, like Sweden, like the United Kingdom, have got complacent. They hadn't really been making much of an effort at Eurovision. And all of a sudden, they've now found themselves up against countries like Russia, countries like Serbia, that were throwing their best acts. They were putting on really exciting stage performances. So Sweden might come up with a da-da-da-da-da sort of bland, run-the-mill effort. Russia would come in, they'd be throwing everything at the staging, everything at the song. Ukraine would do the same. Serbia would do the same. Turkey would do the same. Greece would do the same. So in the 2000s, there was a call to bring back the voting juries, and they came back from 2009 onwards. So since then, Eurovision has been decided on the basis of 50% jury voting, 50% public voting. How the jury votes get added to the public votes changes. The rules about that change from time to time. Voting patterns with televoting. By and large, once televoting came in, there was a certain degree of similarity in terms of different countries' televoting patterns for much of the 2000s and 2010s. Some countries were consistently always likely to give high points to other specific countries. So what was happening here? In some cases, it was a friends and neighbours effect. Some countries were more likely to vote for songs from neighbouring countries. So the former Soviet bloc, countries like Belarus, countries like Armenia were always likely to vote, give high points to countries, to the acts from Russia, because they were next door neighbours. The former Soviets, former Yugoslav states, some of these states had been at war with each other in the 1990s, but when it came to Eurovision, Bosnia, Herzegovina and Croatia were giving high points to Serbia. Serbia was giving high points to Bosnia and Croatia. So a lot of neighbouring states tended to give songs from neighbouring countries high points. What was happening here wasn't political, it was probably more cultural. It was because of the fact that people in the Balkan region liked certain types of music. People in the former Soviet bloc liked certain types of music, but they also recognize, they know the acts from neighbouring states as well. So very well-known Russian acts would be famous maybe also in Belarus, they might even also be famous in the Baltic states. So neighbouring acts, people tended to vote for acts from neighbouring countries because they liked the same music, but also because they recognised, they might have heard of the acts. So in 2011, when Blue represented the United Kingdom, people in Ireland had heard of Blue. Diaspora voting. So if you had large numbers of Turkish people living in Western European countries, they were likely to vote for Turkey. So in the 2000s, you tended to see countries like Germany, Belgium, France and the Netherlands giving high votes to Turkey. And this was in large part because ethnic Turks, the Turkish diaspora in those countries were voting for Turkey. You saw this as well in the 1990s with the Croatian guest workers, or Gastarbeiter in Germany, voting for Croatia. And in the 1990s and 2000s, Germany often gave 12 points to Turkey, 10 points to Croatia. So if you had a big diaspora population in a Western European country, like the Romanians in Spain, and the Polish and the Lithuanians and Latvians in Ireland and in the United Kingdom, where you had a big diaspora population, this had an impact or influence over that country's televote patterns. So in the 2000s, Ireland would be given 10s and 12s to Poland and Lithuania because ethnic Poles and Lithuanians were voting for their home country, or their home country when they were living in Ireland. If a country didn't have a big diaspora population Elsewhere in Europe, if it didn't have very strong friends and neighbours voting ties, then those countries were going to struggle. So for much of the 1990s and 2000s, countries like Switzerland struggled quite a lot in Eurovision. Now, Switzerland won Eurovision only 2 years ago, so things can change. But Switzerland would never be guaranteed a high number of televote points. Switzerland could never go into Eurovision knowing we're guaranteed loads of points from Germany, from France. Because you saw in 2024, Switzerland won Eurovision. The following year, the host of Eurovision got loads of points from the juries, but actually got 0 points from the televote. So a country like Switzerland or Ireland can never really bank, they're never really guaranteed a lot of televote points. Whereas a country like Turkey or Greece or Russia, they usually came into Eurovision knowing that they probably would be guaranteed a certain number of points from neighbouring countries or a certain number of points based on their diaspora populations in Western Europe. So you start to get certain voting blocks. You had the Soviet voting bloc, whereas a lot of the former Soviet states tended to vote for each other at Eurovision. A former Yugoslav bloc, the former Yugoslav states tended to vote for each other. You had a Western diaspora voting bloc, whereas some Western states tended to give a lot of points to Turkey, some tended to give a lot of points to Ukraine, some gave a lot of points to Armenia, some gave a lot of points to Turkey. I said Turkey already. Countries like Britain and Greece as well would also have got a diaspora vote. The United Kingdom and Ireland tended to give a lot of points to Poland and Lithuania and Latvia. But ultimately, you can never rely on a diaspora vote or a friends and neighbours vote to win Eurovision. A diaspora vote and a friends and neighbours vote might be enough to ensure you did okay at Eurovision, but you can never win Eurovision solely on the basis of a diaspora vote and friends and neighbours vote. So here's an example of some of these voting patterns. So here's Turkey's tele-voting pattern. You'll see that Turkey at Eurovision tended to get most of their points from Azerbaijan over there in the east. That's because there's common cultural ties between Azerbaijan and Turkey. But most of Turkey's points actually came from Western Europe, from France, from Germany, from the Netherlands, to a lesser extent from Belgium, Switzerland and Austria. So you see in the case of Turkey, there was a very strong diaspora voting pattern for Turkey in terms of Turkey's televote patterns. And Turkey would always be guaranteed a certain number of points at Eurovision because they would know they'd usually be likely to get 10 or 12 points from Germany. They'd always be likely to get 10 or 12 points from France, 10 or 12 points from the Netherlands. They'd probably always get 12 from Azerbaijan. They'd probably get 8, 9 or 10 points from Albania as well, because that's another Islamic country. Outside of those voting, those kind of areas where they'd always get high points, they'd struggle to get points from other parts of Europe. So when Turkey did win Eurovision in 2003, that was when they actually started to get a few points from countries like Ireland, a few points from countries like Estonia and Latvia and so on. Sweden is a classic friends and neighbours voting pattern. Sweden custom tend to do quite well at Eurovision and have done quite well, especially during the 2010s. But Sweden has a very strong friends and neighbours, so they get the really high points from the other Nordic countries. So you're looking at Norway and Finland bordering Sweden. You're looking at Denmark just across, literally just across the Øresund Bridge. And you're also looking at there's partly cut off in this Iceland as well. And they tend to get high points from other countries in the general region, like Ireland and the United Kingdom, Estonia, and to a lesser extent, Lithuania and Latvia, the Baltic states, and so on. Here's Ireland, the most recent voting patterns from Ireland. So Ireland, our most reliable supporter at Eurovision has always been the United Kingdom. In the 1990s and early 2010s, Ireland's most strong support, base of support at Eurovision outside the United Kingdom came from the Nordic bloc, from Sweden, Norway, Finland and Iceland. and Denmark. More or less since Australia entered Eurovision in 2015, that the level of support Ireland's got from the Nordic states has more or less died off quite a bit. We'll still do okay from countries like Denmark and Finland and Iceland, but Sweden's dropped us like a hot potato. It's sort of like a Mean Girls. Like once the new girl appeared in the sea in Australia, Ireland was dropped from the friends group very quickly. Bloody Swedes. Over the last few years, we've actually done quite well in terms of Eurovision voting points from Spain. So Spain have become a big friend for Ireland in more recent years, and Portugal. So we've kind of moved from a Nordic bloc support base to an Iberian bloc support base. We also do quite well with Austria and Belgium, so we send them a lot of thumbs up in that. So the general perception is televoting is more political than jury voting. The reality, however, is the juries to use for Eurovision, there's only 5 members on the juries. Of those 5 members, you get to know how each jury member voted. So if you're a jury member, you're going to be very cagey about voting for certain countries that mightn't be very popular within your own country. So are there biases and politics associated with jury voting? There are. You see different styles of voting associated with the jury vote and the televote when it comes to Russia and Russia's relationship with other former Soviet states. I'll talk more about Russia in a minute. Armenia and Azerbaijan, basically, you can very clearly see from the Eurovision voting patterns how bad their relationship is. So at nearly every contest, Eurovision contest, Armenia never votes for Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan never votes for Armenia. You can actually see the televote ranking for all countries at Eurovision, not just the top 10 countries, but each ranking. And generally, Armenia, whether it's the public vote or the jury vote, Armenia will always rank Azerbaijan last when it comes to voting. Azerbaijan will always rank Armenia last when it comes to voting. Look at Russia's votes at Eurovision. So this was 2016. Russia and its relationships with other former Soviet states. Now, I would argue the real politics in terms of Russia's relationships with neighbouring states can be seen in the jury vote, less so in the televote or the public vote. So in 2016, Russia finished 3rd in Eurovision. Russia had been the out-and-out favourites going into Eurovision, finished 3rd in the end. Ukraine actually won in 2016. If you look at the public votes, most of the former Soviet states gave 12 points to Russia in the public vote. Lithuania and Georgia gave 8 points. So Lithuania and Georgia ranked Russia in 3rd place in the public vote. But by and large, nearly all the former Soviet states gave the 12 points to Russia in that year's contest, with the exception of Lithuania and Georgia. And even Lithuania and Georgia were ranking Russia in 3rd place. Does that give you a sense of the political relationships between Russia and these other countries? At that point in time, Russia, the first phase of the Russian war in Ukraine was already going on. So Russia and Ukraine were politically, there was no relationship between those countries. Countries like Georgia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia had bad political relationships with Russia. So where can you see the evidence of the political relationships? Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus and Moldova were in good terms with Russia. So their jury votes, all those juries gave Russia some points. Belarus, the jury in Belarus gave Russia, and Belarus is probably Russia's closest ally. Belarus gave Russia 12 points from the jury vote as well as 12 points from the public vote. Azerbaijan also gave Russia 12 points from the jury vote, and each one of Azerbaijan's jury members ranked Russia first that year. And that's been the tendency for the last few years. There's a story behind that because in 2014, Azerbaijan gave no points to Russia. Now, Vladimir Putin actually, after the contest, said, hang on a second, I know that we got second place in the public vote in Azerbaijan, so there's obviously some corruption here. The reality was actually that Azerbaijan's jury had ranked Russia very low, and the very low ranking of the Azerbaijan jury totally nullified the kind of second place ranking for Russia in the public vote, because that year they were combining both the jury rankings and the televote rankings. So the problem that year was the very low ranking for Russia by the Azerbaijan jury. Since then, since Vladimir Putin kind of raised the big issue about it, since then the Azerbaijan jury has always ranked Russia very highly, and usually ranked Russia at the top, right up until the point in time where Russia no longer took part in Eurovision, I should add. So you can see on the left, the countries that are on good terms with Russia, they were still giving Russia points from the jury vote. The countries that are in bad terms with Russia, you'll see what happened there. With the exception of Latvia, all those countries were giving no points to Russia from the jury. Georgia ranked Russia in 23rd place. Ukraine ranked Russia in 22nd place. Estonia ranked Russia in 18th place. This was in a year that Russia were expected to win the contest, a year that Russia finished third overall. So the real politics of the relationships between Russia and the other former Soviet states were more evident in the jury vote than in the public vote. In the public vote, there was an element of ethnic Russians living in these countries voting for Russia. But there was also an element, as in the case of Lithuania, there was also an element that people in that country, even in a country like Lithuania, that didn't have a large number of ethnic Russians, the issue there was that people in Lithuania knew the Russian acts. They'd heard of the Russian acts. The Russian acts were famous in their own country. So Sergei Lazarov, the act that year, was well known all over the former Soviet bloc. So people in Lithuania, even ethnic Lithuanians, were voting for Russia because they'd heard of Sergei Lazarov and they liked Sergei Lazarov's music. Now here's Armenia and Azerbaijan, just to make the point that Armenia and Azerbaijan nearly always give each other no points at Eurovision and nearly always rank each other in last place in that contest. The only exception is in 2016, one of the jury members in Armenia actually ranked Azerbaijan in 19th place instead of 25th place like everyone else. But I hope that person's still doing very well anyway. Okay, here's a map of Russia. So this will be a bonus 7th online exercise, which you might want to do. You might need to do it because you'll already have 4 done or 5 done by this point. But this will be a bonus 7th online exercise I'll make available online in the last week of the semester. And there's 2 questions here. Drawing on the ideas covered in part of today's session, try to explain the voting patterns for Russia in this map. So this is a televote map. This doesn't include jury voting. This is based solely on the televote or the public vote. If you can't recognize those countries, I'll throw up another map at the end of this session. So first of all, try to make sense of the voting patterns for Russia. Russia is highlighted in red. You'll see the key. Countries highlighted in blue are countries that are giving a lot of points to Russia. Countries highlighted in green are giving some but not a lot of points to Russia. Countries highlighted in yellow are not giving many points to Russia. So try to explain the map. Just to explain, so you'll see the countries highlighted in blue. If you don't know what countries are, which countries are which countries, it'll be a lot clearer on the last map. The second part of this question, and this is this bonus online exercise 7. In the 2009 Eurovision, Russia hosted the 2009 Eurovision final and semi-finals. That year, Russia spent millions on hosting Eurovision. They spent millions on hosting Eurovision. It was estimated that I think maybe half of the world's LED screens were in Russia for that year's final. So they really spent a lot of money on Eurovision. What was Russia trying to do you think, in spending so big on Eurovision? What message were they trying to send to the rest of Europe, to the rest of the world, in spending so much on the hosting of Eurovision, in more or less trying to make sure Eurovision that year was an out-and-out spectacle? Why do you think Russia invested so heavily in the hosting of the contest? In light of the issues we've talked about today, particularly go back to what we talked about earlier about nation building, but particularly nation branding. What message was Russia, do you think, trying to send to the rest of Europe? So it's an online exercise. So use these lecture notes. Well, obviously, don't copy points directly off the slides as part of your answer. And this is an online exercise. Just a reminder that the online exercises and in-class exercises, the final mark for these for each student is based on that student's best 4 attempts. So if you've done 4 or 5 of these already and you're happy enough with your mark, you don't need to do this. You might have better things to do this week. If you've only done 3 of these, or worse still 2 of these, or 1 of these, or none of these, then do this exercise. You need the marks. And I'll try and post marks for this exercise on Moodle as soon as I can, after people have submitted their work. Now, last of all, as I said, I promised I'd give you a clearer map of Russia's voting patterns. This is a more up-to-date map, so you can see the trends there, but you'll also be able to pick out the countries. Now, some of the countries you can't see because of the dark blue shading. Just below Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia and Lithuania there, just below Estonia and Latvia, you've got Lithuania there and Belarus. So they're the countries highlighted in dark blue there in the northeast of Europe. Down in the southeast of Europe, there's 3 countries highlighted there. You can't see them, but that's Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And you'll see outside of those countries, Slovakia, don't get too worked up about the Czech Republic. Sorry, the Czech Republic is highlighted in blue there, but that's because the Czech Republic at that point in time had only voted for Russia in a few. So it's a small numbers. The Czech Republic is a small numbers, a case of a small numbers problem. It's only a few contests that both countries took part in. So if you get Russia doing very well in all these contests, then the number of votes being given to Russia by the Czech Republic is going to be high, but it's a small numbers issue. The other very high country that you can't see there is Serbia, and that's highlighted in blue there. So Serbia, if you're looking for it, that's the country in the Balkan region beside Bosnia-Herzegovina. So they're the countries shaded in dark blue. All the other countries, I think you'll be able to read their names off this map. Oh yeah, sorry, down in the southeast, you might see just below Turkey, also highlighted in dark blue, that's Cyprus there. So yeah, hopefully that map's a lot easier for you to see if you're doing this exercise, if you choose to do this online exercise. As I said, it's mainly for those of you who probably haven't done enough exercises across the semester. It's the last chance to catch up on some marks. If you've done 4 or 5 or 6 of these and you're happy with your marks, you know, enjoy this week. Enjoy the last few weeks of term. Don't give yourself extra work. If you've done 3 or 2 or 1 or none of these, do this exercise. You need the marks, guys. You need the marks. Okay? I think that's clear enough.